Sejam todos muito bem-vindos aqui ao nosso TAG Summit. E agora vou passar a palavra para o nosso mediador, Lívio. A palavra é sua.
Obrigado, boa tarde. Catherine, I will introduce you both in Portuguese, then I give you back in English, okay? Thank you. Bom, boa tarde a todos. É um prazer aqui estar recebendo tanto Catherine quanto Filipe. Deixa eu fazer uma pequena descrição, né, de ambos. Catherine é diretora de pesquisa e estratégia geopolítica da BlackRock. Anteriormente, ela trabalhou como membro da equipe de análise de estratégia global da BRCG Group. Ela é formada na Universidade de Notre Dame, bacharel em psicologia e antropologia e um mestrado na Universidade de Oxford. Filipe Nasser é conselheiro da carreira diplomática, embaixador, é hoje assessor especial do ministro das Relações Exteriores do Brasil. Anteriormente, serviu nas embaixadas do Brasil em Washington, em São Domingos, na República Dominicana, e atuou na missão permanente do Brasil junto à ONU, em Nova York. É mestre em administração pública pela Howard Kennedy School e, além de diplomata, pelo Instituto Rio Branco e bacharel em relações internacionais pela Universidade de Brasília. So, Filipe and Catherine, on behalf of TAG, thank you so much for your availability here today. Our idea here is to give everyone a broad perspective of current international relations, and then Catherine giving us the foreign perspective, and how do you see Brazil as an actor in this this new geopolitical scenario, and then Filipe on the opposite, saying how Brazil sees the current geopolitical scenario, and then the opportunities and risks that you see for Brazil as an actor in the global scenario. So, Catherine, once again, thank you for your availability, and the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And thank you all for having me here today. It's great to speak with you all. My plan today is to share some reflections on the geopolitical landscape as we see it here at BlackRock. As a general matter, we believe that we have entered a new geopolitical world order. The events of the last 3 years, including the COVID pandemic, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and mounting US-China competition, have really driven profound change in the geopolitical landscape. You know, throughout history, the impact of geopolitics on markets and economies has often been indirect, modest, short-lived. That's what our analysis within BII of 62 historical risk events shows. We looked at what the market impact of these events was, and that was the result. But today's events and kind of the nature of the geopolitical challenges that we're facing today are very different in our view. We believe that these changes and these risks are driving long-term structural change. And they've really brought into focus a new global order, one that's distinct from the post-Cold War period. The key theme in our view is fragmentation. We see the Ukraine war and US-China competition as fueling fragmentation and the emergence of geopolitical and economic blocs in the world. On the one hand, you can see NATO, which is as unified as it's ever been and expanding. Russia and the West are now actively hostile, and Russia and China are growing increasingly close in our view, both politically and economically. This new world order that's emerging is less stable and less predictable for sure, and that presents challenges for global businesses and investors. But what's becoming increasingly apparent is that this new world order will also be more expensive. National security is increasingly being favored over efficiency. Things like diversification and resilience are being favored over dependence. And replacing that multi-decade system that's really optimized for efficiency will come at a cost. A range of analyses increasingly point to the expectation that fragmentation will reduce global output and could increase inflation. This is going to require adjustment from companies and countries, and it's going to be years before we find a new equilibrium in the system. Now, the most important geopolitical division in the world right now, in our view, is the one between the US and China. And we see at the BlackRock Investment Institute, US-China relations on a decidedly negative trajectory. There's really little or no trust in the relationship. There's limited communication between the two sides. There's deep suspicion and a limited understanding of the intentions and motivations of the other side. There's a bilateral and regional arms race taking place. And there's really no political space domestically on either side for accommodation. Now, there are efforts underway by the Biden administration and by Beijing to bring about a spring thaw, if you will, in the relationship. Jake Sullivan met with Wang Yi in Vienna several weeks ago, and we've had a series of visits between senior officials since then, including trips by Secretary Blinken and Secretary Yellen, as well as a visit by the climate envoy, John Kerry. The Commerce Secretary, Gina Raimondo, is also expected to make a visit perhaps this month. The US and China, the two sides are really seeking a new means of engagement in our view. And I believe those efforts are sincere and they will extend through the remainder of the year, hopefully leading up to a meeting between President Biden and President Xi in India in September or in San Francisco in November. That said, any thaw will be fragile in our view, and it's going to be subject to pressure from three sources. The first source is just events. In recent months, we've seen a Chinese fighter jet nearly collide with a US surveillance plane over the South China Sea. We saw a Chinese naval vessel come within 150 yards of a US destroyer. These are very dangerous events and very risky that could mark a flashpoint. But two, the US will also put pressure on the relationship. The Biden administration is taking consistent steps to compete with China, including through what we expect in the next week or so, a potential outbound investment review mechanism, which would really look to monitor and potentially prohibit US outbound investment flows in areas like semiconductors, artificial intelligence, quantum computing. And within the US Congress, there's constant confrontational pressure. Already this year, both the House of Representatives and the Senate have proposed nearly 250 pieces of China-related legislation. And then the third source of pressure on the relationship is coming from China itself. We've seen a strong push to open the economy and enable a flow of capital into the country. But in recent steps, we've seen Beijing take a number of steps that push against that. That includes some steps to intimidate Western businesses, as well as direct actions to respond to US steps, for example, export controls on gallium and germanium, which are two minerals that are really key to the manufacturing of semiconductors and almost exclusively controlled by China. We'll wait to see how they respond to this outbound investment review mechanism that the US is proposing. So the question leads us to is, are the two sides decoupling? And I think the answer is geopolitically, absolutely. But economically, it's a much more complicated story. The US and China maintain a large economic relationship. Trade last year hit a record $690 billion. Now, that may diminish over time, and we've started to see that in the data, but it will remain substantial. That said, the US and China are pursuing targeted decoupling, driven principally by national security concerns and focused especially on technology. While targeted to date, we do think that decoupling will increase in time, and it could become increasingly multilateral as the Europeans and US allies align with US steps. The second notable feature of this fragmented world, and I'll kind of wrap up on this point before handing it back to you, is what we see as the rise of multi-aligned powers. And this is where Brazil fits in. So the multi-aligned countries, in our view, are the countries that have not taken a side in the contest between the US and China, or they may not fully align with the West's position against Russia. They're very different from the non-aligned movement of the Cold War because these are big, important countries with a lot of influence. If you look at some of the major multi-aligned countries combined, including Saudi Arabia, India, Brazil, Turkey, the 25 largest multi-aligned countries together account for nearly half the global population and a fifth of global GDP. This group of countries has a number of notable characteristics in our view. One, they have questions about the post-1945 world order. They have questions around US and Western institutions. And if you look at just Ukraine, for example, these countries feel that they've paid a disproportionate price for an issue that is not theirs, whether that's in the form of food and energy inflation. But these countries are very pragmatic, and they're aligning with both sides, both kind of the China-Russia bloc as well as the US and European bloc, in line with their national interests. This is in part because we don't know how the future distribution of power will play out, and the multi-aligned countries want to ensure that they're aligned appropriately. But importantly, and I'll end on this, the multi-aligned countries are going to be very influential moving forward and represent a very interesting investment opportunity because they will have a lot of influence in this new world order. So if you look at the Gulf states, for example, they have seen a windfall from high energy prices, and they're a principal source of global liquidity in the world and the swing states and energy markets. So they have a lot of capital and a willingness to deploy that globally. Other countries like Brazil and India have really differentiated amounts of critical inputs to the supply chain, whether that be low-cost labor, large commodities supply. So in this age of supply chain diversification are going to be important players. And then other countries like Vietnam and Mexico, as we think about the trends and dynamics around friendshoring or nearshoring, are going to be very attractive from that perspective. So they're going to be important for us to watch moving forward. And when we think about the implications of fragmentation for investing, I'd make just a few points. First, as I noted, these dynamics will almost certainly be inflationary and could reduce output over time. Second, there will be countries that benefit from strategic investments in industrial policy. This comes amid that broader push for self-reliance and self-sufficiency. So sectors like technology, like clean energy, infrastructure, defense are going to be big beneficiaries of this. That said, other countries, as we see a diversion of investment flows, could be disproportionately negatively impacted. We're going to see trade and financial patterns shift, with geopolitics increasingly rewiring economic and energy relationships. And then finally, over the long term, this fragmentation could make the global system more vulnerable to shocks as we see less international cooperation to solve major crises. So ultimately, there's opportunities in this trend and how we think about the geopolitical landscape, but there are very significant risks as well as we think about the long-term outlook.
Great, Catherine. Thank you so much. Filipe, what are your thoughts about that? And how do you see the Brazilian role in this general scenario that Catherine correctly, at least in my view, has put to us?
Boa tarde a todos. A very good afternoon to all of you. Let me first spend a minute to thank everyone at the TAG team, Thiago, you, Lívio, and Letícia, for the very kind invitation, for the warm welcome here today. Let me also convey Foreign Minister Mauro Vieira's apology for not being here today. He is in Belém do Pará, accompanying the President at the Amazon Summit, which is, by the way, something we can talk a little bit more in the future. There's so many things that Catherine said, and also let me say hi to Catherine, that touches upon things that we've been thinking, discussing, and reflecting upon in Brasília at the seat of the Foreign Ministry of Brazil. In so many things we see eye to eye on. What I thought I could do was to try to show how we see two timelines crossing at the beginning of 2023. And those are the geopolitical trends that have been shaping up for the past 10 or 12 years since President Lula was last in office. Of course, he was last president in early 2011, and he came back to power to the Palácio do Planalto early in 2023. And how Brazilian foreign policy appears as he came back to the world stage. And some of the phenomena Catherine spoke about are things that we have been also very, very attentive and careful about, since they are phenomena that reach and have an influence in pretty much every state actor across the world. So I would highlight a tendency towards diminished cooperation among states for the past 10 or 12 years. And I think what we once was called the Arab Spring has been a major failure or a debacle from the point of view of so many international actors, especially those who were craving for more political freedoms and more stability and less volatility coming from that part of the world. Of course, the occupation of Crimea in 2014 and the ensuing war in Syria that claimed the lives of 500,000 people and produced around 10 million refugees spanning across the Middle East and Europe are also part of this phenomenon, this particular phenomenon. At the same time, you had a separate phenomenon, which is, of course, intertwined with some of the things we've been saying, which is the rise of extremist movements with transnational characteristics across the world, including in Brazil, including major players on the world stage, but including in Brazil. what used to be called the threat of climate change and global warming is no longer a threat, is a very concrete and sensible thing that is, it suffices to say that the record temperatures that have been found in Europe or the Northern Hemisphere this past summer are an example of the kind of consequences that the world can face if we don't manage to control the rise of global temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial revolution levels in the early 18th century. The UN Secretary General António Guterres said we're already past the age of global warming. We're now entering the stage of global boiling with very dire consequences for every aspect of human life we can think of. Another phenomenon which had a very visible impact and a very tragic impact on every aspect of human life was the global pandemic, which reached Brazil very, very harshly, and also the United States very harshly, and not only leaving a trail of deaths and suffering, but with major impacts on global supply chains and maritime shipping lines, and so on and so forth, a surge of inflation in the aftermath of the pandemic. Another phenomenon that piles up is what is being called a deglobalization, which is a reversal of a recent historical trend for countries and economies and societies to be more integrated. Some people are observing international, what's happening in the world and saying this phenomenon is now being reversed with the surge of protectionism. And like I said, international cooperation among states there being fewer incentives for international cooperation among states. All these phenomena pile up, and they're all intertwined with perhaps a bigger phenomena, which Foreign Affairs, the famous journal, American journals, characterized as the return of geopolitics. And I think, all these intertwined phenomena conspire to creating this moment where the characteristics of the global order are not exactly clear. From the standpoint of Brasilia, we see a truly multipolar world system being built, but its features and its how it's going to shape up, it's not exactly clear. What I think I beg to disagree with Catherine is that this new order, being more multipolar, being more democratic, being accessible to countries coming from what's now being called the global south, like Brazil, is not necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily a negative phenomenon. What is unclear now, if it is truly multipolar global order, will take on the characteristics of being cooperative, which needs countries, especially the main poles of this, again, multipolar global order, to cooperate and manage responsibly the world order by respecting international law and abiding by the rules of the game, or if it's going to be essentially based on conflict and competition. It's unclear at this point which way it will go, but certainly the war in Ukraine is not a promising thing if you think about this sort of intellectual framework. I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit more about Brazil's position on the war in Ukraine. I'm happy to share my thoughts with you. So this is the Brazil that is greeted by, this is the Brazil and the world that President Lula is greeted by when he comes back to office on January 1st. And at the same time, this intertwining phenomenon are happening across the world, and Brazil is part of them in many ways. It's a Brazil that had been practicing a foreign policy which was, I'm trying to choose the right words here. Perhaps self-isolation and retrenchment are the diplomatic terms, what I'm trying to say. So Brazil shunned itself away from the world in the past few years, breaking with some of our best diplomatic traditions and renouncing foreign policy principles, some of which are enshrined in our own national constitution. Don't want to go too much into that. I think this is a phenomenon a lot of people would recognize, but I want to say that with President Lula coming back, his main priority is to restore Brazil's credibility across the world, having Brazil restore its place in the world and on the main international and multilateral debates of the world. Brazil wants to add its voice and wants to help conform the international norms, which are defined, in our view, primarily through multilateral institutions. So rekindling our multilateral commitment is one of the ideas, one of the platforms he brings back to office. Another one is a strong commitment to regionalism and to the integration of South America on the one hand and Latin America and the Caribbean on the one hand. There are several examples for these past 6 and 7 months that demonstrate that we're committed to using Brazil's sheer size in terms of population, territory, and economy and manpower to be an actor, a force in favor of regional integration. Brazil coming back to the community of Latin American states and Caribbean at the beginning of the year, certainly one of those examples, but also the added political impulse to Mercosur is another one. So multilateralism, regionalism, and what we call universalism, which is also one principle of one foreign policy directive that we take very much seriously, which means that the brave Brazil sees itself on the world stage is that we see ourselves as a global player, and that implies that we want to have at least open channels of communication with every and single actor on the international stage. And that means a handful of things. And one of them is that we tend to maintain relations and good channels of dialogue with people that we do not agree with. But having those channels of dialogue in place is tremendously useful, not only to do business and promote Brazilian goods and services across the world, but also to talk diplomacy, to talk geopolitics, and to be a force for the peaceful resolution of international disputes, which is, I think all of you are having the word Ukraine on your minds right now. Having those channels is something that it's deeply ingrained in Brazil's diplomatic DNA, and this is exactly what's happening right now. One other issue, which is not exactly a foreign policy principle, but it's certainly a very strong commitment on the international stage with very deep internal ramifications, is our commitment to the preservation of the environment, the fight against climate change, and the promotion of sustainable development. We are having right now, as we speak, the Amazon Summit in Belém do Pará, joining together the 8 countries of the Amazon Basin with a very strong environmental agenda. Amongst various actions taken on the internal realm, including strengthening the environmental protection agencies or the commitment to stop or to eliminate net deforestation by 2030, or to replant 40 million hectares of native forest in the Amazon. One very big, thing, and I think this will resonate well in this room, is Brazil being an active part of the carbon market going forward. With all of that will certainly be a major asset for Brazil as we again reunite in Belém do Pará in 2025 for the Conference of the Parties, COP30, which will happen in Brazil for the first time. So again, some of these trends are happening as we speak. The Brazilian diplomacy doesn't have a clear answer for all of them. I can assure you all we've been watching very attentively and carefully, but Brazil once again to be a force of good and stability and peace and the promotion of development and the creation of a more multipolar world order that's based on the multilateral institutions, and the institutions of global governance are reformed to the benefit of especially the countries in the developing world. Thank you.
Great, Filipe. Thank you. Great. Both Catherine and Filipe, thank you so much for your comments. I do have a few questions, and then later on we open for questions from the audience. But you see, we are like in the age of uncertainty in a Hobsbawm way, but new uncertainties. So we are transitioning from previous equilibrium to a new one, and we are not quite sure where it is right now, though it's more costly, and it creates dire straits in international relations. Catherine talked a lot about this harsh relationship between China and US, and it seems to me that came to be with us for at least a quarter of a century. And then they are actually fighting to see who will be not the sole power, but the leading power in the second half of the century. And how do you see Brazil playing a role in such a world where China is obviously very important for us in economic terms, but also US is very important for us, not only in economic terms, but also in geopolitical terms. Do you think that Brazil has the ability to be in middle of both and talking with everyone, as Filipe said, and not spooking anyone? How do you see that?
Sure. I think one thing that, at least under the current Biden administration, is one of the objectives with US-China relations. Yes, the relationship is broadly competitive across a range of dimensions, including politics, economics, technology, defense. The two sides, as I said, are really trying to carve out the areas of cooperation from the areas of competition. And so competition is going to be very focused on technology, and specifically those technologies that could lead to military superiority for either the US or China. That said, and as I mentioned, it's almost inconceivable that you would see a full decoupling of the US and China economic relationship. And I think it's in the interest of the global economy that that relationship continues to exist. And Brazil is obviously a key player in the global economy and in that relationship as well. And so in terms of maintaining kind of global economic stability, Brazil has a role in continuing to promote international cooperation in international finance, in the international economy, maintaining kind of the stability and security of supply chains. I think if you were to think about the US perspective toward this and how Brazil can kind of continue to align with both sides, if you think of both China and the US have red lines. If you think, like Taiwan, for example, is one of them. Should China move forward with an invasion of Taiwan, that would cause a fundamental break in the relationship, including on the economic and financial side. And so if you think about kind of what those red lines are, it's incumbent on Brazil not to kind of pressure either of those, any of those red lines. So Taiwan is perhaps one example. But then on the technology front, like I said, I think like the US is pursuing its own agenda that is supportive of national security. Brazil has its own agenda when it comes to technology policy and security. And so the US will pursue a range of tools to support that agenda, including export controls, sanctions. I know that there's the use of economic sanctions, export controls, restrictions, and the like, certainly mounted in the wake of the Ukraine crisis. And there's some questions about how that changes the global perception of the US and kind of its economic position in the world. But the US takes those tools seriously. And so to the extent that the US and Brazil have a technological partnership, the US will want to ensure that partnership kind of continues to promote the national security objectives of the US. But of course, Brazil is going to make its own decisions in this, and that may include partnership with China in some areas. But with that partnership, the US will be careful to ensure that it doesn't kind of become entangled in areas that it doesn't want to.
That's perfect, Catherine. But in some sense, Brazil is like walking in thin ice, in a sense that you have those two big players that you have to deal with. And it's not really known where this relationship will go. And then I asked Filipe about that. How do you see Brazil in terms of this global scenario that it's changing so much? And talking a bit more about economics here, but especially if you think about supply chains. Brazil is very entrenched on the upstream side of the supply chains for both US and China. And there is in this administration, there is a lot of talk about this neo-industrialization. And obviously, it's moving up in the supply chain. But how do you see Brazil pursuing that role, but once again, having to supply all those big players in an upstream position?
Thank you, Lívio. We've been getting this question a lot. Where do Brazil sit between Washington and Beijing? And I guess the answer is we don't. We sit in South America. We see ourselves as a powerhouse for South American integration. We're a proud member and a prominent one of the Western Hemisphere, where the U.S. is located. We have such traditional relations with the United States, which, by the way, celebrate 200 years next year. But we also have very strong relations with Beijing. We're members of the BRICS. We have a long-standing, Catherine mentioned science and technology. We have a long-standing partnership with China on science technology, which, of course, had grandfathered our satellite program back in the 1980s. China, if the U.S. is our main single individual investor in Brazil, China is our main trading partner. So we don't hedge. We tend not to hedge between those two major players on the international scene. We understand there's a rivalry being shaped. We would like that rivalry to be managed to the benefit of world peace, stability, and development, prosperity. But we see ourselves as our own international actor with our own set of interests, and being able to do diplomacy, trade, investment, science and technology, cultural, educational cooperation with both of them, and not only with them, also with other actors on the international scene, with India, with South Africa, with the European Union, which of course is a major player also for us in terms of trade and development and diplomacy. One thing that we watch very carefully is that the tendency for nearshoring is something that we are not so sure that benefits our own supply lines. And this is, of course, because we have such a strong relationship with countries in the East, including China. If nearshoring means for us regional integration, a strengthening Mercosur, then we'll certainly be in favor. But if not, we'll have to have second thoughts on how to see this.
That's a great comment, because whenever you see, especially, how can I say, more heterodox economists, they usually say that a country has to be strong with a strong industry. But you give me a glimpse that not necessarily. It depends on how do you integrate yourself with global supply chains and what are the costs of producing things in a certain country. We don't have to produce it all. We just have to be more, how can I say, efficient. But that's another point I'd like to ask Catherine. You said a few times that we are getting into an age of cost inefficiency. So it reverts a bit of the globalization that we saw previously, but in the end, costs, they bite. And how do you see those things getting along, in the sense that we will have this push for deglobalization at which levels of price? In the end, costs, we'll say it again, to produce all in the East Asia, and we will revert all those strategic and geopolitical ideas that have been hovering around ever since the pandemic.
Sure. So I think this is a big risk, and institutions like the IMF and the World Bank have started to do some real quantitative analysis around these trends. The reality is that in countries where you do see strategic investments made to boost supply, to boost manufacturing in these kind of advanced industries of the future, so whether that be clean energy, technology, and the like, they will benefit from public investment. So we've seen a real sharp increase in industrial policy. We've seen this especially in the US, for example, with the Inflation Reduction Act, the Chips and Science Act, focused on semiconductor production, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, really focused on boosting kind of US infrastructure. So there will be benefits there. But what will happen is we're going to see a lot more redundancies. So I mentioned this system that previously existed was created to optimize for efficiency. It had low-cost inputs, low-cost labor, taking advantage of countries' strategic advantages in different parts of the supply chain. So when I mentioned that Brazil is actually really well-positioned kind of in this system of shifting supply chains, it is because of what you mentioned. Like, it is a key player in the upstream dynamics. So especially in terms of its commodity supply, that's something that you can't just make up in other countries. Yes, you could build new factories, you could build new infrastructure to support these industries in other countries. You can reshore supply chains to an extent, or perhaps friendshore them, but that commodities question is going to be really important one to think about. It's one of the key challenges when you think about competition between the US and China and clean energy development. Like, China right now is almost a near monopoly on some of the key raw inputs to clean energy technologies. That's something that's hard to create. And so that's why you see things like export controls that China has announced on minerals like germanium and gallium. But you also see some actions on the US side to try to kind of protect its supply of those minerals. And so we're going to see kind of inflation and price increases in certain areas. I will say there is a subset of kind of the emerging and developing markets that will be negatively impacted by this trend, because they are those areas that would have previously seen kind of investment flows focus from global companies as providers of key inputs to the supply chain. But as you start seeing those supply chains reshore, unless those countries have really differentiated kind of unique inputs to the supply chain and established supply chains already, you're not going to see the types of investment. So on the one hand, you're going to see it's going to be expensive because you're just kind of rebuilding supply chains and creating redundancies, so it's not efficient. But on the other, you will have less diversification. There's going to be fewer sources of inputs. Supply chains are less likely to be kind of globally diversified in a way that they may have been previously. So the goal is to kind of increase resilience in some ways, but you are introducing new sorts of risk to the system in terms of kind of the lack of diversification that you would otherwise see.
Great. And once again, talking about costs, I'd like to ask Filipe about that. Brazil is naturally a power horse for green energy. So how do you see Brazil playing this role? Is there a state agenda for that? And as a provider and eventually a creator of new technology related to green energy?
Thank you, Lívio. That's actually a great question, because there is. I think the Lula's administration comes back to office with such a strong environmental commitment. And like I said, the reforestation in the Amazon, the eradication of illegal and net deforestation. But also on the other side of the equation, Brazil has already one of the cleanest, it's not the cleanest energy mixed amongst the major economies in the world, around 76 to 80% of clean energy. That's mainly because of hydroelectric power. But now we're highly invested, for example, in green hydrogen, which is it's a technology we're leading. It's a technology that it's being developed in the states of the Northeast, which, of course, as you know, needs strong state action to promote development and economic growth. And a general commitment to making fossil fuels more efficient. I don't speak for Petrobras, I speak for the government. But Petrobras doesn't see itself anymore as an oil company, but as an energy company, and that's because they want to absorb green technologies and green sources of energy into their own mix, into their own business. So I think the answer is yes. I think in many ways Brazil can be a leading voice in the rest of the world when it comes to promoting this energy transition, because we have done our homework, and we've been doing our homework for such a long time. If the past few years haven't been exactly exemplary, I think the next few ones will be.
Great. Well, we have still 10 minutes to go. I don't know if there's any question from the audience. If not, there is a sort of tradition when I host panels here to ask you quick questions, and you have to tell me why, and very, very short answers. So in a sense, I would like to ask both Filipe and Catherine, starting with Catherine, how do you see, which are for you the biggest risks and opportunities in the global geopolitical scenario nowadays, and why? Not talking about the Brazilian perspective yet, then we do that later. But for you, speaking globally, which are the main opportunities and risks, and why so?
So we've spent a lot of time talking about the risks related to the US-China relationship, but I'd flag just 3 other risks that are very prominent in our minds at the BlackRock Investment Institute. And the first is a protracted crisis in Ukraine and a lack of resolution to the conflict. That's one of the risks. The second is the risk of a conflict over Taiwan and any potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And then the third potential risk is and this one is underappreciated by markets, but a very significant one, and it's the risk of building tensions around North Korea and on the Korean Peninsula, as we've seen North Korea really ramp up its provocations. But from the opportunity perspective, I do think this the opportunity presented by fragmentation in these countries that are emerging with a lot of significant power and influence is a big one. And I think if you look under the surface of some of these, if from an investment perspective, I think there's opportunities in areas like defense spending, like clean energy spending, like advanced technology spending, like cybersecurity prevention spending. So if you think about kind of what the downstream effects of all of this competition may be, it does present an investment opportunity as well.
Great. And Filipe, what are your thoughts?
I guess the global implications of a protracted war in Ukraine and the risk, however unlikely, of the use of a small nuclear device in the context of that conflict. Global warming, however we want to call it, boiling climate change is certainly a major challenge in the coming years, and we'll need to manage to devote our efforts to find ways in which the economy can grow with environmental responsibility to make sure that the Earth doesn't get even warmer. The rise of artificial intelligence and its related systems is something that we are not fully able to wrap our heads around. I think is a major challenge, and one from the standpoint of a country from the South is the growing inequality, not only among nations, but also within nations, which is, of course, one of the most dire consequences of the pandemic, concentration of wealth.
Great. And then the Brazilian perspective, once again, Catherine, risks and opportunities, but specifically related to Brazil.
Sure. I think the biggest risk is the one that you highlighted, which is amidst this fragmentation and kind of increasing competition between the US and China, the West and Russia, Brazil really walking that kind of fine line in partnering with both sides, and the concern that certain countries may not always be able to align with both sides, especially in certain areas like technology. But I think the biggest opportunity, as I've said, in this age of supply chain diversification, Brazil is really well placed. So as we think about the fragmentation of the global economy, Brazil is going to be a country that really stands out with a strong economy, with a strong resource base, with a commitment to clean energy and to protecting the environment. I think all of those position the country very well going forward.
Great. And Filipe?
Certainly from the point of view of Brasilia, fighting hunger and poverty across the country, which of course is a structural problem in our country, but it's been all the more so in the past few years. I think managing the energy transition with an eye to, again, helping with the environmental equilibrium of the earth. And internally, I think strengthening our democracy is a major challenge that we are all very much committed to. On the international stage, I think since our voice is back into the fold, I think we are very committed to helping craft a more an international world order that's more amenable to countries in the global south, including so many of them, but Brazil especially. The reform of global institutions, including the UN Security Councils, is at the top of our priorities.
That's great. So a lot of challenges and a lot of opportunities in both speeches of you both. So Well, I don't see if there are any questions from the audience, so we still have 5 minutes. So I would like to ask Catherine if she could ask something for Filipe. And the other way around. Yeah, I love to do that, sorry. But is there anything that you would like to ask Filipe and to have this perspective from Brasilia?
Sure. I mean, one thing, Filipe, you teed up earlier was kind of Brazil's position on Ukraine, and I'd love to hear more about how you're thinking about that.
I kind of saw that coming. No, thank you, Catherine, for the question, and I think you give me an opportunity to perhaps clarify our position, which sometimes is misconstrued. Certainly, Brazil's position is not one of neutrality, and this is a big myth that goes around, and I understand why. And I think neutrality implies a certain difference towards the result of the conflict, and that certainly is not the case. And we're not either in the middle of the road between Russia and Ukraine. We have condemned time and again the invasion of Ukraine, the violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. But what we want to be is part of the solution. We believe that the solution to the war lies on diplomacy and direct negotiation between the parties. And what we have offered as a country, coming back to the world stage, is this very vast, broad network of international contacts to be a force to bring the parties back to the table, and to, if we're not able to commit on a big peace accord at this time, at least you can make progress on specific files related to the conflict. Certainly the grain initiative, which has just expired a few days ago, is one area. Humanitarian efforts is another area. A swap of prisoners is another one. Reconstruction of critical infrastructure is another one. So we feel that if the conditions are not ripe for a big peace conference to bring peace back to that part of the world, at least we can make small progress on small fronts that can build up and become, at some point, the basis for direct negotiations between the parties. Brazil wishes the war had never happened. We like war. Oh, we like war. We like peace. We like stability. We like prosperity. We like development. We like for the international waters to be free. Freedom of navigation. This is a core cardinal principle of Brazilian foreign policy. Now you have the Black Sea not free because of the war. So the war is not to our interest. What we want to have is a peace that takes into account the interests of the whole of Europe, the European regional architecture, and also leads to an enduring and stable peace. It's not enough to bring the parties to the table and sign a peace agreement. This peace agreement needs to last, needs to be enduring. And we feel that in our place, coming from a part of the world which is distanced geographically from the war, this gives us perspective. And we want to be a force in favor of diplomacy there.
Great, Filipe. And then I'll give you the opportunity to seek revenge and ask her something.
We're partners in crime here. I'll ask Catherine, this comes from a personal perception, that Brazil is oftentimes underappreciated in the United States as a global player. And I would like to ask her if you agree with that assessment, and if so, how this can be changed.
Sure. So I can only speak from my perspective as an analyst on these topics, as opposed to kind of a governmental perspective. I would say from an investment perspective, Brazil is very much not underappreciated. We see Brazil as, and emerging markets generally, as an incredible investment opportunity. And in fact, the BlackRock Investment Institute, of which I'm a part, publishes a weekly commentary, and just this week kind of put out a new commentary talking about why we favor emerging markets and highlighting Brazil as a component of that. So from an investment perspective, I don't see it as underappreciated. From the US perspective, there is kind of an overwhelming focus on the Asia Pacific and on the competition with China. And so that really is where, and I think like through history, we've seen a lot of focus on the Middle East and kind of peace building in the Middle East. But there has been a kind of a sharp shift to Asia Pacific, and with Russia's invasion of Ukraine to Europe as well. I think following the Trump administration, we've also seen a focus on kind of rebuilding the alliance with Europe. And so I understand kind of the perception that maybe Brazil is an underappreciated player. And I think the current moment has made all the more clear the need to kind of rebuild partnerships and relationships with countries around the world, including Brazil, India, these countries that we do see as very important and influential going forward. So I think there is a renewed focus on that, and that will be a focus kind of going forward. But some of the other foreign policy priorities of the U.S. and of the administration, almost by virtue of events, have had to take precedence with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with potential risks coming from China. And so I think there's always a balance of how many kind of foreign policy priorities you can focus on at a time. But I don't think Brazil is underappreciated. There may be more resources going to other areas.
So great. So we come to the conclusion of this panel. I'd like to thank so much Catherine and Filipe. It was really insightful, and I hope we keep in touch. Thank you so much. See you. Bye-bye.